So when we have Jesus, who is the second person of the Trinity according to the Christians, taking on a human nature, he becomes not only dependent, but everything that is the human nature becomes subsisting within the Son, the second person of the Trinity. The issue is now that you either believe that God contradicts himself by taking on a contradictory nature, or you don't believe in God.
Well, according to your definition, God is dependent on his attributes, which means God is dependent, which means it's not contradictory for Jesus to be dependent as a human if he is God. And if he's not dependent on his attributes, then it is not contradictory for Jesus to become a man and take on the dependencies of a human because he laid aside and enrobed himself in human flesh, laying aside certain attributes because after all, he's not dependent, is he? Which means he's not dependent on these attributes, which are of his essence, but he's not dependent upon them. Does that make sense? There's no contradiction here.
And I was presented with an interesting question.
I was recently tagged in this video. Let's check it out.
And that is, why can't a man be God? When you present your reasoning to Christians as to why Jesus can't be God, and you say because he was a man, that's the question you often get, is why can't a man be God?
No, you're flipping the question. We don't ask why can't a man be God. The question is, explain to us why God cannot become a man. Explain why it's not in his prerogative to become a man.
You have to take it to such a building blocks level because of the amount of indoctrination that has unfortunately occurred in these people to where they can't really discern what the attributes of God are from the attributes of man.
Since you bring up the topic of indoctrination, which school of thought are you a part of concerning the attributes of God? Are you Salafi or are you Ashari? Which school of thought? Do you think the attributes of God are more metaphorical or are they literal? Do you believe about the status of God's speech? Is the Quran the literal attribute of Allah? Is it distinguished from Allah? Is it eternal, therefore being a part of Allah? Or is it independent from Allah, yet it's his word? You guys have your own problems, so I don't think you're going to be able to adequately articulate Christianity's understanding of the attributes of God when in Islam you have so much disagreement concerning the very nature of the attributes of God. But we'll go ahead and try and figure out the answer to your question anyways.
So you have to kind of guide them along this process of, can God contradict himself? Obviously not. So therefore, if God were to take on a contradictory nature or to do things which are contradictory to his nature, it just can't be true. It'd be illogical at the very minimum.
Another question you might pose in context of this questioning and line of reasoning is, can God create something that is contrary to his nature? Now, both Islam and Christianity would agree God not only cannot do something contrary to his nature, by implication of the fact that God will not do something contrary to his nature, he will not create something contrary to his nature. Salafi school of thought in Islam takes what the Quran says about itself, that it's an eternal, that it's a preserved tablet in the heavens, and will say, well, if the Quran is an eternal attribute of God, it's the speech of Allah, which is an attribute of Allah, and it's a preserved tablet, it means that this preserved tablet is physical, it's eternal, and it's an attribute of Allah. So you have an attribute of Allah that is in a physical form. Interesting, because anything that is physical is created since God is spirit. So God created something uncreated, a physical tablet that exists forever. Now, I know not all Muslims believe that, but that is one of the line of reasonings within Islam. It's an acceptable view.
So when we understand Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, according to the Christian belief, becoming God.
No, Christians do not believe that Jesus was a man who became God. This is a common misconception because that's the way that the Quran presents the Christian belief. But the Quran, on numerous occasions, misrepresents Christian belief. For example, the Quran lumps Mary in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that it's God the Father, Mary the Mother, and Jesus the Son. That's not the mainstream Christian Trinity view. Nobody even knows who the group was that Muhammad was responding to in disgust of them believing that Mary was somehow part of this Godhead, one of three gods. The Quran represents the Christian belief as Christians believing that there are three separate gods. We do not. So the Quran cannot be trusted to accurately represent Christian view, and that's why your not accurately representing the Christian view. We don't believe a man became a God.
It's in their belief that he is fully man, fully God, fully taking on all the attributes of man and fully taking on all the attributes of God.
Again, a complete misrepresentation of the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. Jesus is God. He is Yahweh, who laid aside certain manifestations of his attributes, okay, and he took upon him the form of a man, fully including the attributes of a man. He took upon him the nature of humanity, a humanity, by the way, that he created and called good. It is not contrary to the nature of God to take on a form of that which he created, since it is good and God is good. So again, you're misrepresenting Christianity by saying that Jesus took on attributes of God. No, Jesus always had the attributes of God. He always shared the glory that God shares in attributes, in essence, and in being, okay, John 17. And at a point in time, God became a man, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Again, the Salafi school of thought says that the Word of Allah became a physical book. So if you want to understand better the incarnation, look at the school of thought in your own system that says that the incarnation of Allah's speech is a physical book. How can Allah's attributes be contained to a physical book? Learn the reasoning within your own system, understand the disagreements, and understand that even with Christians, we have disagreements in what it exactly means for God to be who he is, because he is transcendent, but God has made himself known through the person of Jesus Christ. And you can only know God if you know Christ. And you don't know Christ because you're deliberately misrepresenting what Christ even said of himself and what Christians have held since Christ walked the earth. And we still hold to this day what Christ revealed about himself and his nature.
When we think about this from a basic perspective, do any of the attributes of man contradict the attributes of God? The answer is yes. Very easy one is dependency, right? Is God dependent on anything? No. But obviously humanity is very dependent on a multitude of facets.
Before you ask yourself that question, first ask yourself, which school of thought do you hold? Are you Salafi or are you Sunni? Do you hold to the classic Sunni position on this question? And the question is God dependent on his attributes? Meaning, are his attributes essential to his nature, or are they distinct from his nature, attributes that flow from his nature, act independently from his nature, and yet can only be attributed to him because they are attributes of Allah, right? So the point I'm getting at is whether you are Sunni or Salafi, you are going to make a statement where you say that no, the attributes of Allah do not define Allah. They are attributes of Allah. They are from his essence, but Allah is not dependent on his attributes. As long as we can agree on that, then we can better understand how God can robe himself in human flesh, which is not contrary to his nature and his essence. He can take upon him the nature of a man, which is what the New Testament taught, that God is both fully God, Jesus is fully Yahweh, and fully man. And the way we understand that is called the hypostatic union. We can look at that later. But I want you to ask yourself this question. What is the one thing that is the most core essential to the nature and essence of Allah or Yahweh? It's simple. His eternality. He is eternal. He is. That was the name he gave to Moses. I am. He is the eternal, existent one. Eternal and self-existent. He depends on nothing. So even his attributes are not essential to his existence, even though they flow from his essence, okay? So as long as we're on the same page here, okay, because we're talking about mainstream Islamic thought in Tawhid, which also carries over. It took a lot of this philosophy from Christianity as well, because we have the similar discussions. But where we diverge is where the Sunni mainstream will say that Allah cannot become a man because he's a remote transcendent, completely separate from us. Whereas Christianity will say, no, God created us, and it's within his prerogative, if he so desires, because he's God and can do whatever he wants, to take upon him the nature of a man. Jesus becoming a man did not mean he ceased to be eternal. If you can understand the concept of eternity, the eternality of God, then you'll understand a little bit better the nature of the incarnation. But at the end of the day, you can only truly grasp the divinity of Christ if it's revealed to you by the Spirit. Now, this isn't an exclusive belief that Christians hide. You can access it if in sincerity and humility you seek the Father and ask him to reveal to you who Christ is. If you seek him, you will be found of him. But just so you understand, there's no contradiction here by Jesus taking upon him the nature of a human. It doesn't contradict God's nature because God created humanity and he created all things good. Jesus was without sin and he is good. He covered and laid aside some of his attributes because, again, we agree God is not dependent on his attributes. And so if he is not dependent on his attributes, then he doesn't need to manifest his attributes at all times. So he can take upon him the form of a servant. And if you're worried about Jesus as a man being dependent, just know that he's also eternal. Jesus existed before he became a man. Read John 17. Jesus is very clear on that. He says, glorify me with the glory which we shared before the world began. Before anything physical was ever created, Jesus existed. He is the eternal Word of God, the second person of the Trinity, who became a man at a specific point in time. Okay? So taking upon him human nature does not mean he ceased to be eternal. And even when Jesus died, it doesn't mean he ceased to exist. Right? So Jesus is fully God, fully man. It does not contradict the nature of who God is. And it makes sense when you understand and comprehend that the nature and essence of Yahweh is three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, one Yahweh.